Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video we will make a text input component styled after one that I found on the Airbnb website that I thought looked pretty cool and had some nice usability. The text input will require the user to enter a minimum number of characters and will also cap the user at a maximum number of characters. As we can see in this demo here on the Airbnb website, we have a little message at the bottom telling us that 150 characters are needed. And as we type characters in, it tells us how many more characters we need to satisfy the minimum number of characters. And then once we have satisfied the minimum number, as we can see here, it tells us how many characters we have remaining. Here in my code, I'm going to add a component to the components directory, and we'll call this min-max text input. And we'll type in the basic code for creating a skeleton of a component. So we're going to import React from React. We will import view, text, and text input, which are the components we'll need from React Native. And then we will export default class min-max text input, which extends a react.component. And for our render method, we will return a view. And for now, we'll just add some text that says min-max text input. Now in the app.js file, we will import that component into our main screen. So let's import min-max text input from components / min-max text input. And then we'll display the component on our screen to make sure everything is working properly. And there we can see it at the top, but to make it a little bit easier to see, let's add a view here, and we'll give the view some padding of 50 to push that input down just a little bit. Okay, back in the component, we're going to pass in two properties to the component. One is going to be the minimum number of characters required, and the other will be the maximum number of characters required. And to help me remember my properties, I always create a static default props object. And this not only helps me to remember the properties that I want to pass into this component, but it also provides default values, which can help you with error handling in case someone forgets to pass in a property. The names we're going to use are min length, and we're going to set the default minimum length to 0 in case you don't want to have a minimum length. And we'll use max length, and we'll default that to 999. Since this component is essentially a text input with a message right below it, we want the interface of the component to work exactly the same way as a text input. So what we'll do is we'll create a text input here, and we'll pass in all of the properties that are passed into this component directly onto the text input. So that means that users of this component can pass in a value or an onChange text property or any of the properties that the text input takes. So to do that, we can use this this.props, and that will pass everything into the text input. And part of the reason that we wanted to make the max number of characters property called max length is because the React Native text input component actually has a max length property, which will stop letting the user type in more characters if that maximum is exceeded. Now that we're able to pass in properties directly to our text input, let's go back to the main screen and pass in some of those properties to make the component a little bit easier to use as we're testing. So I'm going to add a constructor here, and we'll have a state which has a text input value property, and we'll initialize that to be blank. And then in our component, we'll set the value equal to this.state.textInputValue. And we'll also set the onChangeText function to update that state variable. So we'll say text input value is equal to text. And let's also give some style to the text input. So we'll set a border width of 1, a height of 40, and a width of 200. And save and refresh. Now we have a nice box with our text input, and we still have that message down there, which we're going to change to look like the one on the Airbnb website. I'll also add some padding here. Okay, back in the component, let's change this text here to be a function called this.renderMessage. which we will define right here. And this is the function that will figure out what message we want to display below the text input to tell the user how many characters they have remaining or how many they need if they don't have enough. And let's also go ahead and import style sheet up here, because the Airbnb one, I noticed it has orange text if you need more characters, and it has black text if you have enough characters. So let's create a style sheet right here. We'll say const styles equals style sheet.create. And we'll create two text styles. One will be called neutral text, and one will be called invalid text. And for the invalid, we'll set the color to orange. The most difficult part of building this component will be figuring out all of the logic to render the message. So let's walk through each of those cases one by one. The first thing we want to do is store off the length of the user's input. So we can get that by calling this.props.value.length. However, there may not be a property called value depending on whether the user has passed one in or not. So let's use the ternary operator to check if it exists first. And if it does, then we'll get the length of it. And if it doesn't exist, we'll just assume it's 0. So what this is doing is it's saying if this.props.value exists, then we want to set length equal to this.props.value.length. Otherwise, set it to 0. And let's create another variable called message, which we'll set to blank. Now, before we start doing our cases, let's make a couple of functions to build out our messages. The first thing we want to do is take a look at the Airbnb, and we can see in this one, when there's not enough characters, we have 141 more characters needed. And I assume when we get down to 1, it's going to need to say one more character needed without the S. So let's first make a function that takes a number and returns either characters or character so that the grammar will be correct. So let's just call this one get character, and this will take a num characters input, and we'll just say return num characters equal 1. So if that's true, then we want to return character, and if it's false, we want to return characters. Now we'll need 3 message functions, one for at the very beginning state, which tells you 150 characters are needed, one for when the user does not have enough characters, and it'll say 141 more characters are needed, and then one for when they have enough characters, which will say how many are remaining. So to help us remember, let's write some comments here with the messages, and then we'll go through and make functions for each of them. So the first one was X characters needed. The second one was X more characters needed. And the third one was X characters remaining. Now let's start with the first one, and we'll make a function called getCharacterMessage. This also takes a num characters. And we can return, and we can use this template literal syntax. So let's set $ brackets, and we'll say num characters. And then we need to get the character word from our getCharacter function. So we'll say, use the template literal again, and we'll say this.getCharacter num characters. And we'll say needed. And just to make sure that's all working, in our render message function, let's set our message equal to this.getCharacterMessage, and we'll just put a 10 in there, and then we'll return text message text, and save and refresh and make sure that's working. So there it says 10 characters are needed, and if we change that to a 1 and refresh, we'll see it says 1 character needed. So that looks like it's working okay. Put this comment above the function as a reminder of what it returns. Now let's make a new function. We'll call get more characters message, which also takes a num characters variable. And this one will return almost the same thing. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, and we'll just rearrange some of the words. So this will say num characters, and it should say more, and then the character word based on if it's one or more, and then the word needed at the end there. And finally, let's make a function called get characters remaining message, which will take num characters. And once again, I will just copy and paste this, save a little bit of space, and this one will say x characters remaining. And I'll copy these comments over so that we have a reminder of what each of these messages looks like. And now we have functions to generate the string messages for all of our different cases. Now we want to go through all of the possible cases that the user can be in. They can either have not enough characters, or they can have enough and be below the maximum, and so on. And this part of the code takes a little bit of thinking about because you need to do things in the correct order. I've already thought about it a little bit and figured out what the order should be, but you might have to sit down and work it out in your head if you're doing this from scratch. The first thing I want to do, though, is go to my screen, and I want to add in the min length and max length properties. So I'm going to set, for testing purposes, the min length to be 3 and the max length to be 5. That way we don't have to type a whole bunch of characters each time we want to test it. I'll save and refresh. And then we'll come into this render message, and there are going to be a few different cases that we'll need to handle. The first case is if the user has exactly enough characters. And if that's the case, if they have the maximum number of characters allowed, then I don't want to show a message at all. So I'll put a comment here that says user has max number of characters. So what we'll say is if len is equal to this.props.maxLength, then we just want to return a blank view rather than any kind of message, because there's really nothing to tell them. They've got the maximum number, and they shouldn't be allowed to type in more than the max anyway, because the text input will stop me. So here I'm typing in characters and it doesn't let me enter anymore. Now the next case will be if the length is greater than or equal to the minimum number. So I'll say if len is greater than or equal to this.props.minLength. And in that case, they've got more than the minimum, so they've already satisfied their requirement. So we just want to tell them how many more characters they have left. So in that case, we want to show this message, x characters remaining. So we'll set our message equal to this.getCharacters remaining message. And the number that they have remaining is equal to the maximum allowed minus the number that they already have. So this will be this.props.maxLength minus len. And now we want to return a text. And since they've already met their requirement, we'll just give them neutral styled text. So we'll say the style is equal to styles.neutral text. And we'll display that message. And that will return the correct message in that case. And let's put a comment here. User has more than minimum number of characters. Okay, the next case that I want to handle is if the user does not have more than the minimum, so they have less than the minimum, meaning they need to type in more, but they haven't started typing at all, so it's at the very beginning. And that's actually a slightly different case. If we come back to the Airbnb, we can see that before you've started typing, it doesn't immediately show you orange text, and I kind of like that because it doesn't make you feel like you've done something wrong because you just haven't started yet. So that's the case where if len is less than this.props.minLength and len is equal to 0. So in this case, what we want to say is we want to use this message right here, x characters needed. So we'll say message equals this.getCharacter message. And the number that they need is equal to the minimum length that we've passed in. So we'll pass in this.props.minLength. And once again, this will be a neutral style of text, so I'm just going to copy and paste this right here, and we will return a neutral text that says x characters needed. So let's put a comment saying what that case is. So user does not have enough characters, but hasn't started typing yet. And now the last case will be if the user doesn't have enough characters, but they have started typing. And so if we look at the example here, that's where we see the orange text telling us how many more characters we need before we've satisfied the minimum. So in this case, it will be if len is less than this dot props dot men length and len is greater than 0. In this case, we want to say x more characters needed, so we'll call this function right here. And the number that they need is equal to the minimum number required minus the number that they already have. So it'll be this dot props dot men length minus len. And we will then return a text. But in this case, we want it to be the orange text. So let's give it a style of styles.invalidText. And we'll display the message and end the text component. And we'll put a comment here saying what case this is. User does not have enough characters and has started typing. And now, just in case we somehow managed to not get every possible case that the user could be in, let's just return a blank view. So if for some reason all of these if statements failed and we get down here, we want to be able to return something, and we'll just return a blank view so no message will be displayed. All right, so let's save and refresh and test it out. Now, before I've started, it says I have 3 characters needed, which is exactly correct. If I type in 1, now we get the orange text saying 2 more characters are needed. If I type 2, then it's now telling me I have 2 characters remaining, because remember our maximum was 5. And then when I get up to 5, the message goes away, and if I try to type more, I'm not allowed to do so. I also want to test the case where the minimum is 0. That could be potentially a special case, so I'll change my min length to be 0 and refresh. Now it's telling me I have 5 characters remaining, and I never get any sort of minimum warning because there is no minimum. The minimum is 0. And finally, I want to update a little bit of the formatting. I think that the message is a little bit too close to the text input, so what I'm going to do is add a little bit of padding to the top of each of these text styles. So I'll give a 5 padding on each of these and refresh and see how that looks. And I think that looks a little bit nicer having some space in between. And now we have a nice text input component that we can use almost exactly the same way as a normal text input, but now we can add these new properties, min length and max length, and get some nice messaging to the user to indicate what they are required to do. Thanks for watching the video.